Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, we will get started. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be mostly talking about unemployment and employment. If you've downloaded the slides early, if you downloaded the slides from Waddle, the slides on Waddle say employment and unemployment as the title of today's lecture. But I'm hoping to get through a decent amount on credit markets and on money, and so today might also be called factor markets, because credit and labour are going to be our major factors of production. So we'll be talking mostly today about unemployment and employment, and depending on how much time we have, we'll also be talking about credit markets. We'll also talk a little bit about money and how money works, but we'll see how we go. For the mid-semester results, there have been some delays. I was really hoping to have these out by last night at the very latest. But last night at the very latest, when I went to find these, I found about 30-odd exams that had one question that hadn't been marked. So that question is currently being marked, so the results will be out today. I'm hoping the results will be out today at about 12:30. So basically just after the lecture. One of the first things I'm going to be doing is putting up those results, if I possibly can. The average for the exam, again, it's only approximate because I don't have those last few results, which mucks up some things a little bit. But the average for the exam looks like it's about 63 or so out of 110, which, as I was just mentioning to a student earlier, is a little on the low side of what I was hoping for, but is within the bounds of what I was hoping. I was hoping for 60 to 80 as the range, or 60 to 75 as the range out of 110. So 63 is within that range. It's on the low end. This is just to give you some idea of where I was coming from and where we ended up. So it's a little low, but it's not too bad. In terms of, because people always ask about reallocation, what's it called? Scaling, about mark scaling. If there is any scaling, at the moment I'm not seeing a strong need to do scaling for this course, because I expect the exam marks to be a little bit lower, and for the personal project and the problem set marks to be a little bit higher, and so for the average to work out at about 65, and that's not out of the question at this juncture. If there is to be any scaling done, it will be done at the course level. I'm just letting you know immediately now, and that's going to be, most of you are not doing any other economic subjects, but in every economic subject that I've ever seen, every lecturer that I've ever talked to, scaling is done at the end of course level. So when we get all the marks back, then we do any kind of scaling that we might do. This is just to let you know, if you're asking about, have the marks been scaled? The answer is no. No marks for any individual assignment will ever be scaled. There is a possibility that marks are scaled at the end of the day, at the end of when we have the final grade for the course. Exam viewing will be held during the office hours next week, so that's these times on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of next week. If you want to have a look at your exam, I encourage you to have a look at your exam anyway. It's more important in other courses. It's less. It sounds really bad, but it's true. It's less important in this course because there's such a strong divide between the first half and the second half of the course, and so it's still helpful, but it's not as helpful as it is in other courses. But I do encourage you to come and have a look at your exam. It'll give you some idea of what questions you did well, what you understood well, what you didn't understand, so that you can grow, learn from that. That's most of what I have to say about the mid-semester. I can probably say more stuff later, but again, because of that sharp divide, I don't think it's as important to talk about at length as it is usually. But any questions, concerns about the mid-semester? No, it's been a little while. It's okay? That surprises me. Okay, I don't have much in the way of other admin to talk about. There's an assignment due next Tuesday. The personal project is due next Tuesday. Problem set 2 is due Friday of next week, which is not the next Friday, but Friday of next week. Those are due when they're due. That's most of what I have to talk about in terms of admin stuff, but I'm happy to take admin type questions. Admin issues. Nothing? Again, very surprising, but okay. In that case, let's talk a little bit about factor markets. So most of what we're going to talk about here are going to be unemployment, labor market. I'm going to do something that's a little bit unusual. I'm going to talk about employment as a bargaining system, which is not in the text, is outside the textbook, but is, I think, interesting. And then we'll talk about credit markets, and we'll talk briefly about money. For most of you who are doing things like finance degrees or even accounting degrees, the stuff on credit markets and money is going to be hopefully really super straightforward. But it'll be what it is. Let's just dive right in. So unemployment. Oh, I would say one more thing. The reason why we call these things factor markets, employment markets and credit markets, is because they behave quite a lot like our goods and services markets that we looked at in the first half of the course, but they're not exactly the same. The notable difference is the rationale that we're giving for why we have a market in this way, for why people are demanding the factors of production, why people are supplying the factors of production. We no longer have statements like direct marginal benefit. It's not like I buy, in the way that I buy a sushi roll because I like buying a sushi roll is not the rationale that is given for why firms hire workers. Firms don't hire workers because they like to hire workers. Firms hire workers because they gain some other kind of benefit. They gain some downstream benefit of hiring workers, which is basically by hiring workers, you can produce more goods, which you can then sell for profit. But it's not the hiring of the worker that is of the benefit to the firm. It is the secondary benefit, is the fact that once you have the worker, you can use them to produce goods, which you then use to produce profit. And similarly for credit, firms don't want to borrow money, right? They don't gain any intrinsic benefit from borrowing money, but by borrowing money, they can turn that money into product, which they can then sell to make a profit. These are why factor markets are similar, but not exactly the same as the goods markets we've seen before. Anyway, that was my first off rant. So, employment, or rather unemployment. So unemployment is going to be the key thing for today. Unemployment is a measure of the number of unemployed people in society. And so what we need formal definitions, what makes someone unemployed. A person's unemployed if they did less than 1 hour of paid work or work in the family business in the previous week, and they are actively looking for additional work. They are actively trying to find work. Sorry. The unemployment rate is just the proportion of those people actively looking for work and who are, well, the portion of those people portion of those people, oh, I should fix that. Portion of those people working or actively looking for work, but who are unemployed. And again, we'll come to this will be made clearer in the next slide. There was a typo in this in lecture 9, in last week's lecture, that we didn't get to. There was a not in here, which is just wrong. So this is corrected. As a society, we don't like unemployment, because if we have unemployment, then we have resources in our society that we're not using to produce stuff. And producing stuff is good because we like stuff. Okay, this is going to be more helpful. We talk about 3 types of people, if you like. We're going to have people who are not in the labour force. This is people who are neither working nor are they actively looking for work. Lots of people fall into this category. It's completely fine. Lots of students particularly fall into this category of just not in the labour force. The reason we make this distinction is that we're not concerned about people who are not in the labour force. Because if you're not in the labour force, if you're not working, but you're not looking for work either, this isn't a problem from society's perspective. Right? You don't want to work, and you're not working, which is great. Who here is not in the labour force? Not working, nor looking for work? A couple? Yeah, about 20%. That sounds about right. And then we talk about people who are in the labour force, and we divide the people in the labour force into the employed and the unemployed. So employed are people who have worked for an hour or more in the past week. It's very specific. And unemployed are people who are not employed and who are actively looking for work. Who here is employed? Has worked at least 1 hour or more in the last week? I am. A couple people here. Some other people put their hands up. I'm not going to ask about unemployed. Is unemployed, but is actively looking for work. So we get a few different rates that we're interested in here. We're interested in participation rate, which is the percentage of the adult population who are in the labour force, which is to say who are either employed or unemployed. And we get the unemployment rate, which is the percentage of the labour force that is unemployed. Because again, we don't mind too much if people who don't want to work aren't working. That's fine. We're concerned about is people who want to work, but nonetheless are not working, which is going to be unemployed people. Any questions at this juncture? Questions, concerns? Yep. I do not know. That's an interesting question. Was where does work for the dole fit into this system? And the answer is I have absolutely no idea. I don't. Not again. Not again. It looks like, I would guess, unemployed? No. They have to be employed, right? Because they're working. To meet obligations for the dole, they're working, therefore they're employed for 1 or more hour a week. Yes, so if you're looking for work and are employed, then you are employed. Even if you're doing crappy work that you don't want to do, you're still considered to be employed. And so work for the dole, the only thing that it has to be part of employed rather than unemployed. If you're getting paid for the work. I don't know how work for the dole works. I don't know explicitly how work for the dole works. If you are paid for the work, then you're employed. If you are not paid for the work but have to do it to get your unemployment benefits, then you would be unemployed. So it would depend on the exact nature of the system. So that's why I don't know. Next slide. Next slide. It's an excellent question, and it's on the next slide. Yes? Again, next slide. We'll come to it. Any questions? Okay. So there were 2 questions there that are basically, the unemployment rate looks like a slightly weird thing to be talking about, or the definition we have for employed looks a little weird because it doesn't include things like, because we're thinking about people who are working 1 hour a week, which is not that many hours, but might want lots of extra time. We're worried about people who are on the dole, whether if you're doing work for the dole, which is an employment program that we have, employment program that we have. And so there are some issues with this with using the unemployment rate as the only measure of labour underutilisation. The biggest one that was brought up by both questions here is related to what we call underemployment. So underemployment is where you would like to work more, but you can't. So if you're on a work for the dole program and you're working 5 hours a week, but you really want to be working 36 hours a week. Or you're in part-time work and you're working 10 hours a week, but again, you really want to be working 36 hours a week. We call these people underemployed. And so underemployment is these people. Lots of people are underemployed. Anyone here want to raise their hand and say they're underemployed? Lots of retail workers particularly are underemployed? No one wants to say they are? Well, given that 8% of Australians are underemployed and that underemployment is concentrated amongst the young, while no one put their hand up, I suspect a fairly large minority of people here would class themselves as underemployed. Right? They're working Saturdays, but really they want to work Saturdays and Sundays, say. So as I said, I didn't actually have this figure previously. In Australia, the unemployment rate is around about 5%. It's always around about 5%, or it's regularly around about 5%. I don't have the exact number on me. It's about 5% of workers, about 5% of people in the labour force can't find work, and about 8.2% of people in the labour force are working, but they want to work more. So they're underemployed. And it's an issue. It's a significant issue. It's more people. Yeah. The other issue that we have is that's harder to find. So underemployment is relatively easy to measure. You just ask people, are you wanting to work? Are you wanting to work more? Something that's slightly harder is what we call discouraged job seekers. There's different words for this. There's not a standardized nomenclature for this phenomenon. But this is people who have given up looking for work, who would like to work, really would like to work, but who aren't actively looking for work because they don't see the point in actively looking for work, because they've tried looking for work and they've not found it. Right? They've spent a year or 2 years looking for work, they've not found work in that year or two, and so they've just stopped trying. So this is what we call discouraged job seekers. They don't show up in unemployment stats because they're not actively looking for work, but they still exist. There's lots of these people out there. This is particularly acute amongst women who are discouraged job seekers. So this is a lot of particularly not new mothers, but newish mothers, people who have kids who are like 6 or 7, often fall into this category. They'd like to work, they'd prefer to work than not work, but they're not going out looking for work because they don't expect to be able to find it, or they don't expect to be able to find meaningful work at least. I was really surprised when I looked this up, so I looked this up for this slide, the number of people this affects. The ABS statistics has this at about 1 million, in Australia about 1 million people, which is a large proportion of the adult population, a surprisingly large portion of the adult population. This is almost 5%, or probably more than 5%. It's about 5% of the adult population, which is quite a lot of people. I was surprised. So there are issues with the unemployment rate. The reason why unemployment is useful, or why it's still useful, despite these issues, unemployment, I'm going to argue, is still useful. It's useful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's useful for comparison purposes. Despite the shortcomings of unemployment, it's still better to have 4.8% unemployment than 5% unemployment, regardless of all the other issues. If underemployment is fixed, if underemployment is the same and discouraged job seeker numbers are the same, you want to have lower unemployment rather than higher unemployment, even if you can't take the actual number as being meaningful. Even if the 5% number doesn't mean much, it's still the case that 4% is better than 5%. It's really and it's useful for comparison, therefore, within the same country over time. We can say what happens to unemployment in Australia over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years. We can look at what happens there. It's also useful for comparison between countries. We can say in Australia, the unemployment rate is 5%. In America, it's 4.5%. America has lower unemployment than Australia does, even if the number doesn't matter. So purely as a even if you hate the unemployment rate as a concept, and you think that the fact that it doesn't include underemployment, doesn't include discouraged job seekers, makes it nearly totally useless, I want to argue that it's still, I don't think that's true, but if you do think that's true, then I want to argue it's still the case the unemployment rate is useful for comparison. Right? Even if the number doesn't mean much, still 4 is better than 5. 5 is better than 6. So, this is unemployment. Any questions, problems, concerns? Yep. You can. So the question was, can you get an underutilization rate? And yes, it's called the labor underutilization rate, which is usually just given as this. So there's different ways you could measure labor underutilization. It's usually given as the sum of underemployment and unemployment, which I don't think is really fair, because underemployed people might be doing 5 hours a week and want to do 36, might be doing 30 hours a week and want to do 36. So you need to be a little bit careful with doing that, but you can certainly construct measures of labor underutilization. Possibly. I'm not sure if the pressure on wages argument will be exactly right. I think there might be better measures for pressures on wages because, again, the person working 30 hours a week that wants to work 36 probably isn't putting any pressures to try and improve, whereas the person who's working 5 hours and wants to work, but possibly, certainly. Is a large part of it, yeah? Sure. Yeah, so there's lots of other things you can talk about. You can talk about unemployable, you've got long-term versus short-term unemployment, which I think we do talk about, or I think we will talk about. We don't talk about unemployable, because unemployable are people often, as you say, become discouraged job seekers. If you search for jobs for 2 years and you don't get anything, in a place like Australia, there is an option to drop out of the market. Right? It's unlikely that you will starve if you drop out of the job market. In other places, that's not necessarily true because there is a welfare system here. But yeah, there's certainly other things you could talk about here as well. These are just the basics, as it were. Is that addressed? Okay. Other questions quickly on unemployment? Excellent. So we want to think about the labour market. So there's different conceptions of labour markets, but we're going to do first off, we're going to do the stock standard one that's in the textbook as well, which is labour market as a factor market. So as I was saying earlier, this behaves pretty similarly to our goods markets from our microeconomics section, but again, not exactly the same. The big difference is, as I said before, the big difference is that firms don't want to hire people. Right? No firm says no firm enjoys hiring extra workers because workers are an expense. You have to pay them. And you don't get any direct benefit out of having them. It's not like you get, happiness because you have more workers. In the public sector, maybe, but certainly in the private sector, having more workers is just an expense. The reason why you demand workers, the reason why demand for workers exists, is because you can take those workers, you can use them to produce products, and you can sell those products to make profit. And so because of this, we call demand for labour derived demand. It's just a technical term that was used. When we talk about marginal benefit, it's not really marginal benefit or marginal utility, it's really marginal revenue or marginal profit. And again, I should have said this at the very beginning, the who is doing the demanding and who is doing the supplying has essentially entirely flipped. Demand is now driven by firms, or demand is given by firms because firms hire labour. Supply will be, in a couple of slides' time, supply is provided by consumers, by individuals. So we have our usual sort of setup. If I can move this piece of paper. We have our usual sort of setup. We have amount of labour, we have the wage rate, and we want to argue, I won't do that yet. As I said, labour is supplied by households. The marginal cost of production, the marginal cost of supplying labour is exclusively now opportunity cost. Right? When I supply my labour, I don't use that hour of my time to do something else. Right? I could work, or I could do the next best thing. I could use the money that I've got from other work that I've done to do something enjoyable. Okay, labour demand. We do definitely want to think about labour demand curve being downward sloping, and we think about that because we have a diminishing marginal product of labour, which is to say, and as we talked about way back, the first bit of labour is great, the second bit is still good, the third bit is okay, the fourth bit is eh. Each additional unit of labour is less helpful than the previous, because even though you're producing the same product that sells the same amount, you're producing, in principle, fewer products. Right? The first worker you always hire the very best, most efficient, most productive worker who produces 10,000 widgets a day. Second worker you hire, you get the second most productive, the second most efficient worker who produces 9,000 widgets a day. And then the third worker, which is 8,000, and so on. And so we get a downward sloping demand curve, marginal revenue or demand curve for labour, because we have diminishing marginal product of labour. So this is going to be labour demand. Any questions at this time? Oh, I should say as well, again, while the model is very similar, the rationale is very different. In our goods market, the reason why we had a downward sloping demand curve is because we had lower marginal utility, right? The first good was really great, we really liked the first good. The second good we liked a bit less, the third good we liked a bit less, and so on. Here, each person is less productive, and so produces less revenue, produces less profit for us. Similar, but not the same. Any questions? Questions on demand? Yep. This is all yes. To make our lives easy. To make our lives easy, we're assuming a single labour market. I say this yes. To keep things simple, we're going to ignore huge amounts of issues. We're going to assume there is an aggregate labour market, aggregate labour demand, aggregate labour supply curve for the whole economy. We're just going to ignore all other issues. For now. We will come to it in a moment. But we're going to ignore those issues for now. Questions? Okay. Labour supply. Now, so labour supply is, again, given by households, by consumers who choose how much labour to supply on the market. And I want to argue that, so the textbook says that upward sloping supply curve is obvious, and I want to argue that actually the argument for an upward sloping supply curve is really, really tricky and really unclear, right? Because let's say, okay, let's do an experiment to see if this actually works. I'm curious if this works. So I need you to be like yes, wave your hands when I say put your hand up, so I can actually see people. Who here, if you had to work, if there was a job on sale, job on offer, that pays you $1 per hour, who would work in that market? Who would supply 0 hours of labour? 0 hours of labour for $1 an hour? I want everyone's hands to be up because everyone should be saying no, they're not going to work for $1 an hour, right? If the pay was $20 an hour, who would work for 1 hour a week? 1 hour a week? 2 hours a week? 3 hours a week? Right? There's going to be a range here. If the pay was $20 an hour, who would work for 50 hours? Who would work for 40 hours a week if the pay was $20 an hour? Who would work for 80 hours a week? Cool, good. What if the pay was $1,000 an hour? Who would work for 80 hours a week? Importantly, what if the pay was I'm going extreme here. What if the pay was $1 billion an hour? Who would work for 80 hours a week? That's interesting, because I wouldn't. I definitely wouldn't work for 80 hours a week if the pay was $1 billion an hour. No, because who cares, right? Once I've worked for the first 3 hours, I have all the money that once I work for the first 1 hour or the first 5 minutes, but certainly once I work for the first 3 hours, I've earned all the money that I could ever possibly ever want, right? By a huge factor, by thousands of factors already. By a factor of 1,000, I've already earned enough money to last me my entire life. I don't get any extra benefit from that 4th hour of work, or the 5th hour of work, or the 80th hour of work. So why would I do that? So for me, certainly, if not for too many people here, and this is experimentally shown mostly, the labour supply curve is a bit fiddly in that it slopes back eventually. Because more money isn't helpful if all your time is spent working. If all you ever do is work, then having more money doesn't help you at all because you're not getting anything out of that. You need to have the leisure time to be able to spend the money. Money enhances leisure, but if you don't have any time to spend on that leisure, then there's no point having more money. So labour supply curves, empirically, tend to curve back a little bit. I do say in the slide here that the results suggest that the labour supply curve is typically upward sloping at the relevant wage rates, which is true. in the sense of between wages that people actually meaningfully receive, you know, that $20 to that $20 an hour to $1,000 an hour, you tend to get upward sloping supply. But the argument is empirical, not theoretical. The argument for a downward sloping demand curve is theoretical, right? It has to be, because we have diminishing marginal product of labor, therefore we have a downward sloping demand curve. The argument for an upward sloping labor supply curve is not theoretical, because extra work means you have more money, which means your leisure time is better, but means you have less leisure time to spend that money. So you tend to get something more like this for labor supply. We're going to ignore most of those issues and just have an upward sloping labor supply curve just to keep life easy for us. Okay, any questions? Questions, concerns? Okay. As I said, to keep things simple, we're going to ignore lots of stuff, and we're going to assume there is an aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. We're going to assume that all workers basically look the same, and all employers look the same. Our market's going to have equilibrium when the quantity of labor supplied equals the quantity of labor demanded, as we've always done. We're going to talk about the equilibrium wage rate. And so we have an equilibrium wage. Why am I using this pen? So we have an equilibrium wage rate, W star. We have an equilibrium labor supply, L star, which are our equilibrium wages, equilibrium outcomes. The reason why we expect to reach equilibrium is, again, much the same as we have in the goods market. If the wage were too low, right, if the wage were down at W lower bar, then quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. And so there's firms out there who will bid up, who will pay more for labor, who will go to those workers and say, you know what, I'm going to give you, instead of giving you W lower bar, I'm going to give you W lower bar plus 1. And they're going to get the workers. And that's going to, then, again, push the wage back up. And similarly, if we have a very high wage rate, then we have excess labor supply. And so there's going to be some workers out there who say, you know what, rather than demanding W upper bar and not getting a job, I'm going to demand W upper bar minus 1. And then the employers will hire me. And that's going to, again, push the demand, or push the price down to the equilibrium level. Okay. This is the standard labor market model. Right, this is our standard, Econ 101 labor market model. I'm going to do one more labor market model as well. Any questions, concerns? Okay. I will talk briefly about types of unemployment, because we do want to divide unemployment. One of the ways we can divide people who are unemployed is into two types, into frictional unemployment and into structural unemployment. So frictional unemployment is just unemployment because resulting from the fact that it takes time to match workers and jobs, right? So this is unemployment because when my contract with job A finishes, there's a month before my contract with job B starts, and so there's a month of time there where I'm unemployed. It's not ideal, but it's not the worst thing in the world. This arises due to imperfect information about available jobs and job search times. It's something we'd like to minimize, but it's not something that we would, in a mixed economy or a capitalist economy, it's not something we would ever expect to go away. And it's okay. Right, it's not that big a deal. Partially because these are people in frictional unemployment are people who have been unemployed for not very long, so they can live off their own savings. You don't have significant societal costs due to frictional unemployment. You still have costs, but not significant societal costs. The one you really want to try and avoid is structural unemployment. So structural unemployment in our standard Econ 101 model arises from a discrepancy between the quantity demanded of labor and the quantity supplied of labor. So we talk here about arising basically arising from a couple of factors, but the main one here that we're going to look at is arising due to market intervention, when the government steps in and tries to do stuff in the labor market. So instead of getting to this nice equilibrium point, we don't. Right? There's something stopping that from happening. Structural unemployment can also happen due to, as the economy changes, the economy, as technology changes, you get differences in your skills are no longer useful, right? As the way education is done changes, lecturers become less useful because we have lecture recordings and we have online stuff and all these things, and so lecturers go out and work. Or you have miners, as in people who work in mines, who go out of work because there's no longer a need for people who work in mines because it's mostly automated. So this is also a part of structural unemployment. Any questions on this division of unemployment? Or anything so far? Okay. So, frictional unemployment is inevitable. Government programs can affect frictional unemployment. So, frictional unemployment doesn't exist in, say, a feudal society. In a feudal society, you don't have frictional unemployment because you work in your lord's farm from the day you're born till the day you die. And so there's no frictional unemployment. But because companies close and you have to find new jobs, because we have this changing economy, you necessarily get frictional unemployment. But as I say, government programs can affect this. You can talk about government services to try to match jobs and job seekers, to try to shorten the length of time, right? Frictional employment, part of it is because of imperfect information. And so if you get good job matchings, then you can reduce that. We can talk about public training programs, which, again, reskill you. We can talk about, I want to talk about unemployment benefits because they are a double-edged sword, right? They have benefits but also costs in terms of labor market utilization. Unemployment benefits are not just bad for the labor market, bad for labor utilization. Again, the really, really simple really simple Econ 101 standpoint says unemployment benefits are bad because they discourage you from taking jobs. But there's another side of this, right? Because there's two sides. There's unemployment benefits are bad because empirically they lengthen unemployment. When you give people unemployment benefits, they stay unemployed for longer. This is an empirical fact. However, once they find a job, they are usually put into a much better fitting job. Right? If you don't have unemployment benefits, if there were no unemployment benefits and I had no savings and I lost my job, then tomorrow I would be working in retail, which is not great because I've spent a lot of time training to be an economist, and so all that time becomes unhelpful if we're then working in retail. Because there's unemployment benefits, I might be unemployed for longer, but when I get a job, I would be using all those economist skills. I could use all those skills as an economist. And in the same vein for finance and accounting and so forth, business things. So it lengthens unemployment, but empirically people end up in much better paying jobs, or much better matching jobs, which do tend to be better paying, but also much better matching jobs. So you match your skills and the job requirements. Any questions, comments, problems? Unemployment is determined by a number of different things, right? Again, frictional unemployment versus structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is when demand and supply are different. Quantity demand and quantity supply are different for some reason. Frictional unemployment is just stuff that happens because people are between jobs. So it depends. Yeah. Structural unemployment is the other one. So structural unemployment is when the wage rate is higher than the equilibrium wage rate. And there's a few different rationales for why we might see that kind of behavior. Minimum wage laws, unions, and I'm going to go through each of these one by one. So, the way minimum wage laws work, at least in places like Australia, but in most places, is that the government steps in and says you must pay at least some lower level of wage. You must pay at least the mandated minimum wage. This is exactly what we've called in the past a price floor. This is, we have a demand for labour, we have supply of labour, just to keep things easy, and the government introduces a price floor W lower bar. And you must pay, any worker that you hire, you must pay at least W lower bar. And this causes unemployment, right? Because there's now a difference between the quantity demanded of labour right? Labour demanded and the quantity of labour supplied. There's this gap, and so this is going to be causing unemployment. Because of this gap. This has all the usual deadweight loss that's caused by price floors because we only actually hire L sub D, and so we get deadweight loss in our market the same way as we always do. The area in red. This is not, this is not looking good. However, just to recover a little bit from minimum wage laws, because this is just saying they're terrible. But our model is a pretty slimmed down model, and so because different people are actually paid different amounts. In somewhere like Australia, the great majority of workers receive more than the minimum wage, and so for most workers in Australia, in most industries, there is a minimum wage, but the minimum wage is actually below the market clearing wage anyway, and so it's not causing any problems, at least. There's no upside here, right? In this modeling, there's no upside to a minimum wage. But the extent to which there's a downside depends on to what extent the minimum wage is binding, and the minimum wage is not especially binding is not binding in most cases in Australia, at least. Questions, comments? Okay. We do the same thing for unions and collective bargaining. Unions. For those of you that don't know, hopefully you are all aware, but for those that don't know, a union is a worker association which allows workers to negotiate as a group with employers. Yes, good. So, for example, when I work at ANU, obviously, as you're aware. I don't negotiate with ANU for my pay. Right? I don't go and have me on one side of the table and ANU on the other side of the table, and for us to talk about my pay rates. What happens for me is that the union sits on one side of the table, representing all ANU staff, and ANU sits on the other side of the table, representing ANU, and they discuss a wage agreement that works out wages for all the different people in ANU, with some minor exceptions at the very top. And the benefit of this for the workers is that if I'm negotiating directly with ANU, ANU has all of the power and I have none of the power. If the union as a whole is negotiating with ANU, then the union has, ideally comparable power to the employer. A little tiny bit of history. In the 1970s, more than half of workers were unionized. This number is now more like 15% of workers are unionized. It's much higher in the public sector. It'll be much higher in Canberra. I don't have the numbers, but it will be much higher in Canberra. Public sector employees are unionised at a much greater rate than private sector, but there's been a massive decline in unions in Australia over the last few decades. Unions use collective bargaining. This is this process that I talked about where the union bargains on behalf of all of the staff members. If there's no agreement, you can go on strike, so that takes away any surplus for the employer. The effect of this may be to push the wage rate above the market clearing rate. Right? The effect of this may be to create unemployment. Not necessarily, and again, we'll come to this in our second model, but the effect may be to push that wage rate above the market clearing rate, potentially, and therefore create unemployment. Questions, issues? Yep. The question was, why has union membership fallen? And the answer, there's a large amount of historical argument. A lot of which is not certain. So there's arguments that can be made. One argument that can be made is the increasing professionalization and increasing use of service industries. So in places like in a lot of emerging industries, you don't have the unions because workers are often better off on individual contracts in a lot of those emerging industries. In the Hawke-Keating era, so in the Labor era from 83 to 96, yes, the Labor government was in power and made the accords with the unions. So the Labor market had the accords with the unions, which it gave the unions a lot of what they wanted, but also weakened their power to do anything else. And so you get weakening unions from that. Then you had Howard era from '96, who actively was antagonistic towards the unions and wanted to try to reduce the size of them and enacted policies to try to make union membership less beneficial for people joining and make unions weaker generally. So lots of things have caused the decline in unionism. Yeah. I don't believe CPA, the accounting, the professional bodies, they're not usually considered unions. They have similar roles, very similar roles, but they don't do collective bargaining. They tend to be more for, they do. They certainly do education stuff. Some professional bodies start to do some. Yeah, not really. No is the short answer. They're not usually considered unions because they don't do collective bargaining. They don't organize strikes, so not so much. Okay. Third on our list, efficiency wages. Efficiency wages are where the employer decides to pay more than the market clearing wage rate. This looks like it's a stupid thing to do. I could pay someone only $10 an hour, but I choose to pay them $12 an hour. Why might I do that? What might be the benefits for me to do that? There are benefits. There's a distinction between the benefits for low-income countries versus high-income countries. So the textbook talks about in a low-income country, maybe you could pay your worker $1 an hour, but you choose to pay them $1.50 an hour because it means that they're going to be well-fed, they're going to remain healthy, and therefore they're going to remain productive. And so there's therefore benefits to paying them extra because you then end up with a healthy, well-fed, productive employee instead of a half-starved, not very productive employee. This obviously doesn't hold in places like Australia. If the decision is between paying someone $25 an hour or $30 an hour, you're not going to starve on either of those amounts. So what you're trying to do when you pay them higher here is to attract better employees, and you're trying to retain those employees because there's lots of costs to retraining. So you'd rather not have people leave if you possibly can. So, for example, Aldi, the shopping centre, pays surprisingly non-trivial efficiency wages. It pays significantly more to its employees than, say, Woolies or than Woolworths or Coles, because it wants to, first of all, make sure it attracts only the best of those people who want to work in that kind of field, and that they don't leave. If you work for Aldi and you want to work for a supermarket, you're not going to stop working at Aldi and work at Woolies instead because you take like a 30% pay cut. So they pay higher amounts of money to try and retain employees, to stop people, to preempt people from leaving. Yeah, within the structure of this model, it's going to be a little bit fiddly because if you pay them more, you're paying them. It's not going to work with this model. Is going to be bad for efficiency wages. My other model is also not very good for explaining efficiency wages. I should be clear, but it's going to be something like by paying a little bit more instead of paying. I'm using a new graph. Yeah, no, I'm not going to try and use a new graph. It's concerns outside of the model, because the model doesn't include things like the cost of training. It doesn't include things like the idea that people might leave after you train them, and so you will need a stronger model to be able to talk about efficiency wages. It's not within the scope of this model. Is what I'm going to go with. Something that is within the scope of this model is downward wage rigidity. So this is this idea that workers really, really, really don't like seeing their nominal wages fall. If you've been working at a company making 40 grand a year, right, not making a lot, but making 40 grand a year, and then they come to you and say, actually, we're going to cut your pay to 38 grand a year, you are going to kick up a stink. You are going to be extremely unhappy with that outcome. And to the extent that you will fight that outcome, you'll join your union, you'll really push to not have your wage fall. And so what this means is that even though W star 1 is that if, for example, demand falls, for whatever reason, let's say the product you're producing becomes less valuable, and so demand falls to D2, what should happen in terms of reaching equilibrium, what should happen is for wages to fall to W star 2. But you don't want wages to fall because you refuse to have your nominal wage fall. You're just like, no, I'm not having nominal wages fall. It's not a thing that we're going to do, right? Because, and as well, from the firm's perspective, it can crush morale. Right? If you have 10 workers and you decide to reduce their pay, their morale gets destroyed, reduce all of their pay, their morale gets absolutely destroyed. So what can instead happen is you retain the high wage rate, right? You retain the high wage rate and you just fire a bunch of people, right? So rather than moving from L1, you move from L1 to L2. You fire a ton of people and you have unemployment because the wage rate is still reasonably high, but you don't want to hire the people at that wage rate. And so again, it's a little bit outside the model, but the morale cost of reducing wages is so high that you'd rather just have an inefficiently high wage rate for a little while. This is also one of the benefits of inflation that we'll talk about next week. Any questions? Questions so far? Questions on anything? Because next one we're going to a different model of unemployment. Yep. The question is, do monopolies exist in the labour market? Here, everything we've done so far does not really assume monopolies exist. This is all perfectly competitive labour markets, which again is not really realistic. Because it's not a monopoly, it's a monopsony is the term that we use, because there's no monopolies in the labour market, because the monopoly is where you have one supplier. And we don't have one supplier. There are monopsonies, which is where there's one person who demands the product, who demands labour. And so there is elements of monopsony in the labour market, which is important and interesting, but not what I want to talk about today. Yeah, so ideally we'd move down to this new equilibrium, but because there's that downward wage rigidity, instead we end up at W1 star L2 with unemployment and deadweight loss. That's right. Deadweight loss is, as always, going to be the deadweight loss is going to be down here somewhere because it's the gap between, right, in equilibrium we'd be here, but actually we're only consuming L2. Okay. Now for a completely novel model. Something we've never seen anything like it before. I'm going to talk about bargaining models. So we said before what we decided to do away with was we did away with the fact that workers were different. But we could instead create a model where we really worry about the fact, and we focus on diminishing marginal productive labour. But we could say instead, well, let's not worry too much about diminishing marginal productive labour. Instead, we're going to focus on the fact that workers are different. Because there is huge heterogeneity between employees, between jobs. So a market model certainly does have issues, but maybe we think the issues are so great as to make the market model not ideal. So instead we're going to use a Nash bargaining model. So a Nash bargaining model is where you have two individuals who can make some trade. That trade creates surplus. And the question is, how do we divide that surplus between the two individuals? So we have two assumptions. Combining an employee with a job creates revenue. It creates, I'm going to call it surplus. Right? Because when you're a business, to hire a person, let's say there's $10,000 of hire a person for a year, there's $10,000 of other costs you have to pay, but they bring in revenue of $60,000 a year. And so there's $50,000 of surplus that's created when you hire that worker. And the question is, which is assumption 2, is how are we going to divide that surplus between the employer and the employee? And what we're going to say, as the part of the Nash bargaining model, says that the division between the employer and the employee depends on the bargaining power. So we say that each worker has both, so that the link joining an employer and employee creates some surplus, and the employee has some level of bargaining power, which is going to determine how much of the surplus goes to the worker and how much of the surplus goes to the employer. Not just yet. Okay, let's just go through some stuff first. When we talk about bargaining power here, there's going to be a couple of things built into our notion of bargaining power. One of them is definitely going to be, well, the two main things that I am thinking of is personal traits. Right? If you're the kind of person that really, really doesn't like bargaining, then you have low bargaining power. If you're a really aggressive bargainer, then you have high bargaining power. But also outside options. Right? If I'm going into a wage negotiation and I can say, I can work over there for this much money, then I have really strong bargaining power. If I'm going in saying, if you don't give me this job, I'm going to starve next week, I have really, really low bargaining power. And so the bargaining power is going to be, includes individual traits, but also this notion of the outside option. Right? If the outside option is starve and die, you have no bargaining power. If the outside option is a similar job that you already have, you have great bargaining power. We're going to make general assumptions. If you have more bargaining power, then you get more of the surplus as wages. If there's more surplus, then both the employee can have a higher wage, and the employer, there's obviously a problem here, then the employer can have more profit. So we can graph this, because we like graphing things. So we have bargaining power. And we have wage. And I'm going to talk about two people. I'm going to have someone I'm going to have one person who produces a relatively low surplus, right? %. So I have job 1, which produces a relatively low surplus. I have job 2. Which produces a relatively high surplus. So it'll be useful for later. And so we're thinking about if a person's going for job 1 and they have a low bargaining power, right? If we're down here with a low bargaining power and we want job 1, then we get a low wage rate. If we're going into job 1 but we have a high bargaining power, right? This is the person who otherwise would starve, right? They either take the job or they starve to death. They have very, very low bargaining power, and so they get a very, very low wage rate. Some other person already has a job. They're largely indifferent between whether they get this job or not, but they're happy to take it. It's better, but it's not, a lot better. Might have pretty good bargaining power, and so they're going to get a much higher wage rate. And of course, the point I'm trying to emphasize here is that the low bargaining power person with the good job still gets paid worse, potentially worse, than the person with a low-skilled job but high bargaining power. So we can have different sorts of things happening, right? It depends on, so your wage depends on two things. It depends on your bargaining power and the amount of surplus that the job generates. Any questions? Questions, concerns? Yes? Job 1 would be something like a retail job, right? Relatively low skill, relatively low surplus. Relatively low, I shouldn't say low skill, a relatively low surplus job. One where the additional benefit that you provide, the additional revenue that you produce is not really that high. So job 1 might be the 7th person working at Aldi that day. It's better, but it's not like it's a lot better. Job 2 might be, let's talk about IT work, right? There's a lot of surplus to be produced. You hire someone to make a program for you, and that creates a lot of revenue. But it's not strictly, I want to emphasize, it's not strictly just high skill, low skill, right? trucking jobs in mining companies are more like job 2, right? They produce a lot of surplus, even though they're not necessarily particularly high skill. Yes. Yeah, that should be an employer. Yeah. We're in a totally different model now, right? Totally different model. There's no comparison with the previous one because this model here is really focusing on workers and jobs are different, are heterogeneous. The previous model was really focusing on workers and models are the same. Workers and jobs, sorry, are the same. One more time, sorry? The surplus is just I hire someone, and by dint of hiring them, my revenue will increase by $50,000. That's the surplus that I have. We're trying to divide. Okay. Now, this model is different, obviously, it's a different model, and we can talk about how this model interacts with our various policy interventions, right? Because the minimum wage was purely a bad idea. It was just a bad idea in our labour market model. But the minimum wage is supposed to help workers who are like low-skilled or low bargaining power workers, and that doesn't make sense in a labour market model, in a standard market model, factor market model. But it does. But the minimum wage does have some potential good points in this wage bargaining model. Right? If we introduce a minimum wage, then there's one of 3 possible outcomes. Possibly the minimum wage is below the bargained wage, right? The government steps in and says you must pay at least, let's say this much. W lower bar, the minimum wage. Government steps in, you must pay this much. Oh, I didn't want to put it here. No. I want to put it here. No, here will do fine. Let's just run with it. For now anyway. We put in a minimum wage. Maybe the minimum wage is below the wage that we will receive through bargaining anyway, right? Maybe we're this person here, maybe we're person A who receives WA anyway. You're working a low-skilled job, you're working a low surplus job, but you have lots of bargaining power, so you're fine anyway. Maybe you're a high-skilled person, maybe you're person B here, and you're working a high-skilled job, and your pay rate is above the minimum wage anyway. And so maybe if the minimum wage is below the bargained wage, for those individuals, let's say stop, for those individuals for whom the minimum wage is below their wage they get from bargaining anyway, the minimum wage does nothing. It doesn't help, but it doesn't hinder either. It just doesn't do anything. Maybe the minimum wage is below the total surplus, but above the bargained wage, right? Maybe we're these people down here. Maybe we're person C or person D down here, right? The high-skilled, low-skilled worker, but with low bargaining power. For us, the minimum wage is just good. For us, the minimum wage is really lovely because the effect of the minimum wage doesn't cause unemployment. We don't lose our jobs because of the minimum wage. All that happens is instead of getting paid these low levels of pay, we get paid the minimum wage. It's still worth it for the company. The company still takes home some of the surplus, right? In job 1, the company will take home this much surplus, right? This is the surplus the company will take home. In job 2, they'll take home a much larger amount. But there's no unemployment. No one loses their jobs. It's just the worker gets a larger share of the surplus. This is good, or this is the minimum wage doing what it's supposed to be doing. This is part of the reason I like this model, is that we get a nice outcome where we can say the minimum wage has a purpose. This is the purpose, is to try to do this. Now, that said, this is not perfect. Minimum wage is potentially the minimum wage is too high, if you like, in the sense that the minimum wage is set up here somewhere, right? W bar high. We have some high minimum wage, and this does create unemployment. Because in this high minimum wage, job 1 is no longer profitable, right? There's no, even if, you would, as a company, you would prefer not to hire a person in job 1. Because the amount of surplus, the maximum surplus, is below the minimum wage that you can pay them. So you have to pay them more than the surplus. There's no benefit to this for you. So this does create unemployment. right? Because job one, with this very, very high minimum wage, job one ceases to exist. So there are upsides and downsides. Pardon? Pardon? On the graph, or graphically the surplus is just, is the highest this goes, right? So this is the surplus for job one. Because it's if the worker has 100% bargaining power, it's the wage of the worker. So if the worker takes home all of the surplus, so this is the surplus for job one. Up here is the surplus for job two. Surplus just means, I don't want to say revenue because it's not quite revenue. It's revenue minus the non-wage costs. So when you hire someone, there's non-wage costs associated with that, right? You have to train them, you have to do some stuff. You have to pay some money. I don't want to include that in the surplus. So it's not quite revenue, but it's close to revenue. Does that address your concern? No. Okay. One more time then. Does it address your concern? That's okay? Okay. Questions, concerns? Yes. Oh, okay, yes. There's a yes. If the bargaining price is exact. Oh, if the bargaining. Oh, if the minimum wage is equal to the surplus. You mean? So yes, there's corner cases like if the minimum wage is equal to the surplus, or if the minimum wage is equal to the bargained wage. If the minimum wage is equal to the bargained wage, then it doesn't do anything. You pay the minimum wage, but that's the wage you would get anyway. If the minimum wage is equal to the surplus, then it's a question of it's a tie-breaking rule question. You would normally model it as the job exists and pays the minimum wage, but it's a zero probability event that happens, so we don't worry about it. Yes. Then the firm will make zero profit. That's the case where the worker has 100% bargaining power. I don't know that would exist. I don't think the worker will ever have 100% of the bargaining power. But in principle, it could, I suppose. But yeah. Okay. Wage bargaining and unions. So this model is also nice because we can directly model things like the effect of unionism, which is that it increases the bargaining power of workers. The union steps in, and the union, instead of having low bargaining power, we are able to get higher bargaining power. Right? So all these people that were down here get pushed up and have a higher bargaining power. We don't have unemployment, at least in the short run, we don't have unemployment. It just makes workers better off because we push their bargaining power from being low bargaining power to being moderate or high bargaining power. The downsides that can occur from this are that you do actually need, as we talked about with like monopolies, with like marginal cost pricing for monopolies, for example, you do need the firms to take home some surplus, right? You do actually need, because if the firm has its marginal impacts of marginal revenue and marginal costs, and this is what we're talking about here for marginal stuff. But the firm also has fixed costs. So if the firm doesn't get enough of the surplus to cover their fixed costs, then they're going to have to close down in the long run. So if all of your workers are up here, right, if all of your workers are up here with really, really high bargaining power, you're taking home a tiny amount of the surplus. You have to use that surplus to cover your fixed costs. If you can't cover your fixed costs, then you have to close down. So the downside of the union, the downside that may occur is if the unions are so strong that workers take home so much of the surplus that the firm is forced to close down. This is always trotted out as the boogeyman for unions, as like the downside of unions. They'll close down shops because of their unreasonable wage demands. I don't know of many instances of this actually happening, but it certainly is theoretically possible. It's within the model. This can occur. Questions, concerns? Okay. All right, it's not too bad. Wage bargaining, we can model downward wage rigidity in a fairly significant way. So we can say that the previous nominal wage rate is a really, really strong anchor for future negotiation. Right? If last year I was paid $40,000 a year, I can go in and say, look, I need $40,000 a year this year. I need at least $40,000 a year this year because I'm not taking a wage cut. And so downward wage rigidity can be modeled as existing workers having a really strong bargaining position that says my wage should at the very least not fall. So what we're talking about here is the worker in period 1, the worker had bargaining power 1, and so received wage 1. And this is at time equal to 1. Right? This is the surplus that exists at time equal to 1. Then suppose that the firm becomes less profitable, right? The product that they produce becomes less valuable. That means there's less surplus from hiring workers, right? There's less surplus from hiring workers, so in time 2, we have less surplus to work with. The worker can go in and say, look, last time I was paid W1, I want at least that this time. And so we can model this as an increase in bargaining power. The job has less surplus, but the worker is in a very, very strong bargaining position to say, you're not cutting my wage. So they take home a larger portion of the surplus. And again, the same as before. This may be a problem if the firm has to close. It's maybe a problem if the firm has to close because of not being able to get enough surplus to stay open. Yep. 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 Yeah, so you could, if you had significant cuts to surplus, you could have downsizing within this model. Lost my green pen. No, there it is. You could have if you had a significant shock, so thinking more like, here the firm downsizes, because at the old wage rate, it's just not worth having the worker at all, so you would rather fire them than not. And I don't have a slide on efficiency wages because efficiency wages do not work very well within this model. Or you can model them as having higher bargaining power, but I don't think that's a very good model. Very good way of modeling it. I'm thinking of this as over time. I'm thinking of we're producing a product that is getting less valuable over time, and so the surplus from hiring workers is lower. These are... I don't have good lines for this. No, I don't have a good label for these lines. It's just a line linking bargaining power to wage rate for different jobs. No, that should be fine. As long as it's clear what you're doing, it's fine. Yes? High bargaining power means a high wage, yes. Higher bargaining power means a higher wage. But you might have low bargaining power, but the job produces so much surplus that you have a high wage anyway, potentially, right? As we had over way back in the first one. Here we go. Maybe you have lowish bargaining power, but you get an okay wage because you're working a good job. This other person has higher bargaining power, but they're working a job with less surplus, and so the wage is still going to be lower. So your wage is going to depend on your bargaining power, right, the ability to extract that surplus from the employer, and how much surplus there is to extract from the employer. Okay. Any questions? Questions, problems, concerns? Further questions? Yeah, go ahead. Potentially, yeah. Not so much. The Coase theorem, as it would apply here, the extent to which, so I mean, the Coase theorem doesn't apply here, but the idea, I see what you're saying. The idea, the rough idea of the Coase theorem, the vague idea of the Coase theorem in this context would be that if surplus is positive, then negotiation will lead to employment. That's really all the Coase theorem says. Coase theorem doesn't give us, there's no downside here, right? The employment happens and that's good, right? Employment happens because it produces surplus. We're really assuming here that if there is surplus, then it will create employment. Sorry, then the employment will happen. And we're just and the bargaining power is just a question of how we divide that surplus between the two groups. And this behavior happens with, so Coase theorem is a nice way of thinking about it, because this behavior happens with the Coase theorem as well. So the Coase theorem, for those who don't recall, is you have an externality. If you give private property rights, then you can negotiate away that externality. But with the Coase theorem, the negotiation still has, if we get rid of the externality, there's extra surplus to be had, and the Coase theorem doesn't give any insight into how that surplus is divided. Right? This is saying that we could add to the Coase theorem a notion of bargaining power, which would give us some indication of how that surplus is divided. Not necessarily. Because we're thinking here in this model, we're really thinking about workers and the firm bargaining individually. I go to a worker and I look at them and I say, if I hire you, I'll make 50 grand a year. And we negotiate on how to split that 50 grand. And then I go to the next worker and I say, if I hire you, I make 30 grand a year. And we negotiate on how to split that. And I go to the next worker and I say, if I hire you, I'm going to lose 5 grand a year. So I'm not going to hire you. And I go to the next worker, right? So we treat each person individually in this model. And we're definitely not saying if they're all really cheap, we're going to take on more workers. We're definitely not saying that. Because we're assuming that wage rates can be different between different people. Okay. Just another way of thinking about employment. Okay, 2 more types of unemployment. We won't get time to talk about money, but that's okay. 2 more types of unemployment. We can talk about unemployment as either natural or cyclical. So natural unemployment is unemployment which doesn't go away even in the long run. In a lot of places, this is called the natural rate of unemployment. In Australia, we want to do things in a difficult way, so this is called the NAIRU, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. It's a horrible word, but that's okay. So this is the rate of unemployment which, in principle, does not cause changes in inflation. Which we'll talk about, I believe, in week 12. Or possibly next week. So when people talk about full employment, what they mean is employment at the natural rate of unemployment. They don't literally mean everyone employed. They don't even mean unemployment at 0, because it's inevitable. There's going to be some unemployment as people move between jobs, for example. But the natural rate of unemployment is the rate at which we're fine with, so the full employment rate. This is distinct from cyclical unemployment. So this is year-to-year fluctuations in unemployment around the natural rate. So there's a recession. This is what happens when we say there's a recession. And what happens to the labour market? Less people are employed. People still want work. And so there's additional unemployment. During a boom, there's lots of jobs out there. People who would be happy not working instead do work. Unemployment goes super low. So we get cyclical unemployment. And we have some nice data here that shows total unemployment this is Australian data, obviously. Well, not obviously. This is Australian data. That shows unemployment in red and natural unemployment in green. Measuring natural unemployment is a little bit tricky, but there's methods by which the econometricians measure natural unemployment. And so you can see, right, there's a recession here. There's a recession here when total unemployment is above the natural rate. There's a boom period here. This is the various mining booms. This is the GFC. A question was asked earlier, is Australia that they thought Australia was protected from the GFC? Again, I want to argue Australia was protected from the GFC because Australia goes from 4% unemployment to 5.8 or nearly 6% unemployment. In contrast, places like America go from 4% to 12% unemployment. Places like Italy and Spain go from 5% unemployment to 20 or 30%, I think, in the case of Greece, unemployment. Australia is still hit by the GFC. It's just hit a lot less than most other places for a variety of reasons. It's actually rise. Oh, this is only 2012. It is currently falling a little. Yeah. Yes. The underemployment actually is not increasing at the moment. It's increasing over the middle time period, over like the 20, 30-year time period, but over the 5 to 10 year, it's actually been fairly stable at about 8%. Yes, there's an argument that the natural unemployment rate's falling. Quite possibly. So there's lots of arguments like this. So the argument was that because underemployment is rising, perhaps the natural rate of unemployment we should think of that as being falling, which is possibly the case. These are difficult questions that are empirical questions. You'd have to go to data to find out. But no, it's an interesting idea, certainly. There was a big. You can see a big hit here, right? There's a big hit in the mid 70s or in the late 70s, mid 70s, where we do get this big jump in unemployment. So the oil crisis kind of mucks everything up, and it stays mucked up for a long, long time. The oil crisis in the mid 70s changes unemployment from low to moderate, and we're back down. And we're back down now to moderate. Okay, any questions, comments on unemployment? Yes. Unemployment, labour markets, Nash bargaining models, anything we've got. Deeply concerned. I think natural unemployment's not super volatile in this graph. Oh, from here. Yeah, this is the oil crisis. This is things going horribly wrong. This is but basically oil is a major input into everything, and oil goes from being basically free to being basically not free. This is a big structural change in the economy. I can't help you there. Sorry. Yes, but it's a matter of what the long term is. It's a lot less volatile than total unemployment, I guess. Is all I can really say. Than actual unemployment is all I can really say here. There's a question in the middle somewhere. Where was it? Question? Yes. So the natural unemployment rate is, so when the natural unemployment rate is higher than the total unemployment rate, it's suggesting the economy is in a boom. It's that, and so we're going to be driving inflation pressures. It's that there's so many people employed that, so natural unemployment is not just frictional unemployment. It includes a few other things as well. So natural unemployment is unemployment which is not going to go away even in the long run. But the key point here is that it's the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So it's the rate of unemployment that we would expect to have that will not drive cost of living pressures. And it's entirely possible that we have more people employed, it just pushes inflation up. So this period here, we would have a period of, all else equal, inflation is being pushed up by the labour market. Not to say inflation's increasing, because we have other things that affect inflation, but inflation's being pushed up by the labour market. Total unemployment is natural unemployment plus cyclical unemployment, but cyclical unemployment can be positive or negative, I guess. Right? You could have lots of cyclical unemployment. You could have the economy booming so that cyclical unemployment is negative. Yes, okay, that's the distinction. Yes, cyclical unemployment can be a negative number. We can have the cycle causing people to be employed rather than unemployed. Okay, talk a little bit about credit markets. We'll see how we go for time. So our credit market is, again, another factor market. So it's going to have, again, the same sort of similarities to goods markets that we saw in labour market, but again, some of the same sorts of differences. So this is this market which turns savings into investment. To keep things simple, again, we're going to assume that there's one market for loanable funds, for the most part, just to make things easy for ourselves. Savers provide funds for this market. Borrowers use funds from this market. So we think about savers and borrowers. Okay. One of the big distinctions for this model is, again, in our goods markets, we had demand was given by consumers and supply was given by firms. In our labour market, we had that demand was given by firms and supply was given by consumers. In our credit market, we're going to have that demand and supply are both given by both consumers and firms. So consumers and firms both provide demand for credits, demand for credit. So small firms might want to start a business or expand their business. Individuals might want to buy a house, and so these people will go to the credit market and try and borrow money. They borrow credit, they become debtors. In terms of payment, credit is paid for by repaying the initial or principal. Again, this is super straightforward for those doing finance or for many people, hopefully. But they also pay an additional payment of interest, and we use lowercase I for the nominal interest rate. So we're going to have the market for loanable funds, so the amount of credit, the amount of loanable funds that we have, and we have interest. So the interest rate is what we pay. Demand for credit is going to be downward sloping because when we have to pay less, if we're thinking about this from a firm perspective, when we have to pay less to borrow money, then more business opportunities are profitable. If I'm a small business and I'm thinking, and I'm going, okay, if I expand out into this region over here, I'll make a 5% return. Yeah? If my interest rate is 6%, then I don't want to make that investment. If my interest rate is 4% or 3%, then I do want to make that investment. So as the interest rate goes down, more opportunities become profitable. From a consumer's perspective, as the interest rate goes down, the opportunity cost of borrowing money goes down, right? Because it's cheaper. I'm paying less extra money. And so we get a downward sloping demand for loanable funds. Again, we still get downward sloping demand, but the reason is very different. The reason here is that more, especially for firms, is that more opportunities become profitable, is why we see this downward sloping demand. The reason I've written the word interest and not nominal interest or the letter I is that we really care about the real interest rate and not the nominal interest rate. So economists will basically always care about real interest rates and almost never about nominal things. Nominal things vary occasionally, but basically you care about real rates. So the real price of a loan needs to include the nominal interest, but also account for inflation. We have this nice Fisher equation, which relates the real interest rate, the nominal interest rate, and the inflation rate. We always use pi for inflation, as I said 2 weeks ago. Yes, banks advertise in nominal terms. When you go to the bank and you see what they're offering, they offer everything in nominal terms. But from the economist's perspective, what we care about is the real rate of return, is the real interest rate. So I'm going to call this, I'm always going to write the real interest rate. So this is R. We can think about shifts in demand just very quickly. So shifts in demand for loans can come from lots of different things. Changes in the perceived business opportunities for firms. If firms see lots of new business opportunities because the economy is booming or for whatever reason, then we're going to see demand shifting to the right. Similarly, if firms see no business opportunities, if the economy is in recession and there's no good opportunities, the demand curve will shift to the left. For households, really we're talking here about changes in preferences or expectations. If we think that house prices are going to go up really quickly, then maybe we would have a higher demand for credit because it's beneficial for us to borrow the money now to buy the house before the price goes up, or to gain the benefit from that price going up. Potentially changes in government policy if the government is borrowing money, because the government sometimes does borrow, well, the government does borrow money. If the government starts to borrow more money, you would see a shift right in the demand curve here, because there's greater demand for loanable funds. So there's a few different things that might change demand for loanable funds. Any questions, issues at this time? We can talk about supply of credit. So again, we have this annoying thing that happens where supply of credit comes from both households and firms, right? So it's not like our goods markets where we can divide evenly between these types of people demand goods and these types of people supply goods. It's all types of people supply credit and demand credit. We do want to think about the supply curve being upward sloping because when the interest rate increases, households have a greater incentive to save. Those households that do save now have a greater incentive to save more because they can then get more money out of doing so. So we do have, and similarly for firms. So our supply curve, we want to think about upward sloping. Again, we can think about shifts in supply. If we change the savings motives of households, if we get households to want to save more, we're going to get a rightward shift in supply. We're going to get, more supply. Yeah, rightward shift in supply. Similarly for firms, which you can do by changing the regulatory structure around firms, for example. Nope. Okay. So firms do save money. There are firms that have just savings as cash. Apple is notable for this, actually. Apple has recently has just a huge, I don't actually have the numbers on me, a huge amount of savings that's just money in the bank. So it's just supply of loanable funds. Firms often don't have that much in the way of savings, but it is a thing that exists. Questions, issues, problems? Yes? Hopefully, if we used pi for profit, then yes, but inflation should always be pi. Pi should usually be inflation. Profit, there's rarely circumstances when you want to have both profit and inflation in a model. So you would use, if in all these models, inflation is always given as pi. Inflation is always given as pi. Profit, if we have pi available to us, we'll use pi, or we might use, yeah, it's hard because you don't want to use P because P is price. So you would find something else for profit if you had to. Okay, the credit market, because the credit market is not just debtors and creditors. It's also banks. So the banks operate as middlemen, right? So one thing the banks do that is, because you can't just go to, well, it's difficult at least for me as a debtor to find an individual who will lend me their money, right? This is hard to do. So banks operate as middlemen. Banks operate as a middleman or as a clearinghouse, if you like, where they set up the market because they take in savings and they then loan that money back out. They aren't totally useless though. They do manage risk. So they make sure that money is only lent out to those who are actually likely to be able to repay it. In practice, different debtors pay different interest rates based on their likelihood to default. If there's a high likelihood that someone's not going to pay you back at all, then you're going to charge them a relatively high interest rate. If there's virtually no chance they're not going to pay you back, if you know for near certain they're going to pay you back, then you can charge a lower interest rate. This is why governments can borrow money for cheaper than private enterprises. Because the chance of the government, if the government can't pay you back, you have bigger problems than the fact that the government can't pay you back, right? If the government can't pay you your $10 million loan, your society's in real trouble, and this is not the major concern. So the real interest rate in the economist credit market usually assumes when we draw this diagram, we're thinking here about a non-zero likelihood of default. And then on top of that, you might have a risk premium on top of the non-zero rate. So this, to the extent that this number here exists, to the extent that R star exists, R star is our zero likelihood of default. In practice, when you go to borrow money, you pay R star plus some risk premium. And that risk premium is, for example, very high for credit cards. It's very low for mortgage, for like home loans. It's, middling for personal loans. It depends what the risk premium is. Oh wow, we will talk about money. This is really all I want to say about the credit market. I don't have a whole lot to say about credit market. It's a factor market. It's a market that behaves like a market. Any questions? Questions, issues, concerns? Yes. Yep. Where's it going? Sorry, it's just going to be like, yep. In Australia, I don't think real interest rate quite went to negative. In America, it went very, very slightly negative, I believe. Well, no, because in America, I went to zero, didn't it? Yes. In the GFC, in much of the world, R went negative, which is, the GFC is not something, if we had a whole course to talk about GFC, we could talk for years about the GFC. So I don't want to talk about it too much. But yes, this R can be negative under certain circumstances. Yes. Oh no. In the GFC in America, in the GFC, I went to zero. Nominal interest rates went to zero, and so real interest rate was just minus inflation. So we're thinking here about the fact that real interest rate might go negative. It's just going to be that it happens to be negative, right? Yeah. So it's just that demand for funds is so low that no one wants to buy this, or supply of funds is so low that, yeah, yes, it's just this. I don't have a strong argument, I guess. Yeah, obviously the way I've drawn this here, it can't happen. The way I've drawn this particular graph here, it can't. Sorry, you can't see that because I'm pointing well above the thing. The way I've drawn this graph here, it can't happen because because we hit zero credit at a positive real interest rate. But as it turns out, in practice, this is more like this is what the world looked like in the GFC. Because it did. Yes. So if you go to borrow money, if you were a person and you went to a bank, you would still be paying interest in the GFC. Yes, potentially, maybe. Yeah. Everyone pays more than every individual pays more than this level, right? Because every individual faces some amount of, except the government, every individual faces some amount of risk. Yes. I think it's easier. I mean, because the nominal rate just says, I give the bank suppose I'm a saver. The bank says it gives 3% per year. I save $1,000. I have $1,030 at the end of the year, right? So it's easy to work with. It's also that there'd be issues on what the inflation rate actually is, in terms of how it's measured. There'd be all sorts of issues with banks offering things in real terms. What we want to argue is that individuals should think about the real interest rate, and the economy will respond to the real interest rate rather than to the nominal interest rate. No one's suggesting banks should advertise in real terms, but from a theoretical perspective, the real term is what's more interesting. That's all I can say, really. Oh, there is one, so just because GFC was asked about, there is one thing that the nominal interest rate does, which is we have what's called the zero lower bound, so that lowercase I it is thought that lowercase I can't go below zero, and that the banks can't offer, as a nominal amount, below zero interest rates. Because if you go to a bank as a saver, and the bank says, the interest rate that we're going to offer you is minus 0.5%. Give us $1,000 and next year I'll give you $995 back. You will go, no, I will just take my $1,000 and put it in my pocket, and next year I'll have $1,000. And so we get this zero lower bound, which makes sense intuitively, but turns out not to be as much of an issue as was initially thought. Because for $1,000 you might put it in your pocket, but if you have $1 million, you're not going to take $1 million and put it in your pocket for a year because of the chance of it being stolen or lost and the difficulty of actually using it. So there are some issues around. There's the zero lower bound, but it's questionable whether it's a really strict bound or not. Does that? I mean, I went overboard, but yeah. Yeah, sure. Yes. Okay. I'm actually going to say, from a business perspective, I don't think this is, again, I'm not a business person, but I don't think this is going to be really, really vital, because from a business perspective, you're comparing opportunity costs. You're saying, I'm looking to borrow money. The question is borrowing the money more or less profitable than the business opportunity that I have? And you can do that in nominal terms or real terms. It doesn't make a difference whether you measure that in nominal terms or real terms. There might be an issue of, if we think inflation is cratering, then maybe we expect a recession soon. Potentially you could do that kind of forecasting. But that's not really Fisher equation related. Very quickly. Yep. Yeah. We'll come to that in the money section, in section on money, yes. It's important, and it's an important question, and it means that there are some issues with this as a model because of the way the central bank does actually set interest rates, but we'll come to that in the next section, in the next sort of section. Okay, we have 7 minutes, so I'll talk a little bit about money. Not too much, though. Where will I get up to? Somewhere. Okay, money. So, this is our new section on money, very briefly. So money is a type of asset in the economy which people regularly use to buy goods and services from other people. It is not just currency, as we'll see on the next slide. It is anything, we think of money as having three core functions, and it is, as it says, anything with these three properties we want to think of as money. And so our three core properties, the main one is going to be our medium of exchange. You've all heard this before, hopefully. Who's heard all this before? These three components of money? Really? I thought they would teach this in finance. That's all good. From an economist's perspective, money is basically anything with these three properties. It has to be a medium of exchange. What that means is that I have to be able to give you money in exchange for goods, and you have to be wanting to accept that money. This is extraordinarily important and a really, really vital and helpful use of money, helpful thing to have in the economy, because if you don't have a medium of exchange, whenever you want trade to happen, you need to have what we call a double coincidence of wants, which is that when if we want to trade, I need to have something you want, and you need to have something I want, right? This sort of structure, the thing that we're doing right now, you can't have unless you have a medium of exchange, because you are kind of forced to be here to a certain extent. But to a certain extent, I have something you want, which is teaching economics. I mean, I know you're mostly doing finance and business and things degrees, but still, I have something you want, which is teaching economics, and you don't have something I want. And I don't want each of you to pay me individually in, an hour of a plumbing job and 2 hours of cleaning and 2 hours of working in a shop for me. I don't want that. I just am happy to take, because I have something you want, but you don't have anything I want. If we didn't have money, we couldn't trade. Yeah? And so the purpose of money, one of the big purposes of money, is as a medium of exchange, is so that you do have something I want now. You have money. And I want that money because I expect other people to accept that money in exchange for goods and services. We're almost there. In exchange for goods and services. And so money solves this problem of the double coincidence of wants problem, because it acts as a medium of exchange. Really, really super important. Probably the most important aspect of money. I'm going to stand very, very still. A much less important one, but still helpful, is it acts as a unit of account. It's much easier to be able to do trade where we can say, I will give you $10 for this, rather than say, I will give you 5 kilos of rice, because how do I compare 5 kilos of rice versus 2 kilos of wheat versus 1 hour of lecturing versus 2 hours of cleaning is difficult to compare. So being able to have a single thing that we measure the value of everything else in is really handy. So as a unit of account means everything is measured in terms of the amount of money. Very, very handy. It also acts as a store of value. So this is the last thing we want to have in money, which is that I can keep money and next year it's going to be useful, right? So I can store the money that I have now and then I can use it next year. So it stores value. Anything with these properties can be money, and anything without these properties we would not call money. So particularly if we have, say, hyperinflation, then currency kind of ceases to be money because it ceases to be a store of value. Right? It's not useful having Venezuelan dollars. I don't know what does Venezuela use? Venezuelan currency is not really money at the moment because it's not really a store of value because inflation is so incredibly high. Any questions? Cool. I need to know the time. Okay. The issue here is that we have two broad kinds of money. We have commodity money, which is what all money used to be. All money used to be commodity money. So commodity money is where we take a commodity and we treat it as money. So gold, silver, if we talk about in prisons, they talk about cigarettes. They don't talk about cigarettes in prisons anymore because most prisons have made cigarettes a banned substance. So things like noodle packets, like 2-minute noodle packets, I believe, or is it chewing gum? There's a new thing that's used, there's a new thing that's used in prisons as money. But also we have fiat money. So fiat money is when something's accepted as money, but is not backed by any physical commodity. It's money because we say it's money, it's used as a medium of exchange because people accept it, it stores value because we expect that next year people will still accept it. So Australian dollars, any functional national currency is going to be fiat money. Cryptocurrencies are a little bit iffy here. Fiat currencies often, the definitions of fiat currencies often include statements like backed by a government or accepted by a government, which rules out cryptocurrencies. But they have a lot of the same properties as fiat money in that they're only money because people think that they're money. So I think it's very reasonable to include them in fiat money. But as I say, there's some debate over whether cryptocurrencies should be considered a type of fiat currency, a type of fiat money, or a new type of money, which is crypto money. But I think they should be a type of fiat money. But it's questionable. Okay. that was a little tiny taste of money for next week. We are largely out of time, so I'll finish up now. If there are any final questions, you can come and see me now. Otherwise, I will see you all next week, and your personal projects are due on Tuesday. Personal projects due Tuesday. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you all next week.